Of you. My name is Ann-Herred Lang, and I will be your host today for this live online consultation event for the World Humanitarian Summit process. I'll just offer a quick overview of the context of this event, just a couple of words about the summit process. As I believe most of you already know, the World Humanitarian Summit process is a multi-year undertaking to re-examine the evolving challenges facing the humanitarian system worldwide and to explore new structures, priorities, and strategies for the future. It's a very inclusive process that will culminate in a major summit in Istanbul in the spring of 2016. But in the meantime, over these next 2 years, inputs are being gathered from all corners of the humanitarian sector and beyond to all relevant stakeholders, with a total of 8 regional consultations, one of which is currently underway as we speak in West Africa, which is a very exciting start to the regional consultation process, also divided into 4 thematic areas across the world, and a number of different stakeholder groups being engaged in all manner of discussions, events, and position papers along the way. Now, what's very important for us at PHAP is that some of the most important inputs over these 2 years are really being gathered from individuals who are engaged in the work of humanitarian assistance and protection, really speaking as experienced and concerned professionals rather than necessarily from an institutional standpoint. And at PHAP, we are glad to be able to work with the summit team and with other partners to facilitate such inputs both through on-site events, such as the one that we hosted in Dakar a couple of months ago, and as we will be doing in East Africa in early fall, and also online discussions such as this one today. And we're really glad to have all of you here with us for this experience. Okay, so getting into the point of welcoming our guest speakers and panelists today, I'd like to introduce you to 3 guests. We have with us first Carsten Völz, who is the Humanitarian Director of Oxfam International and who has been active in international humanitarian assistance and development cooperation since 1994, working in grassroots projects, in country programs, and also at the regional and global responsibility levels across the world, really, across Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Central America. I'll also note Carsten is, in addition, executive in residence at INSEAD's Social Innovation Center and also a board member of the Sphere Project and a frequent speaker in PHAP's on-site events, and we're delighted to have him with us here today. And Cecilia Jimenez, I would like to welcome Cecilia, who is currently the National Director of the IDP Project for the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She's a Philippine lawyer with a specialization in human rights and migration and has a protection field experience primarily in Southeast Asia, as well as over 2 decades of experience in NGO human rights advocacy for the Asia-Pacific region. Again, a long-time member, governing member, and frequent speaker with PHAP, and we're absolutely delighted to have you with us today, Cecilia. And last but not least, a very warm welcome to Sebastian Rhodes Stampa, who is the Deputy Head of OCHA's Regional Office in Bangkok, as well as OCHA's Regional Civil Military Coordination Officer. He's been based in Bangkok since 2006, and during that time has deployed into numerous humanitarian emergencies arising from both natural disaster and conflict, or in support of response preparedness throughout the region. Prior to his work with OCHA, Sebastian has also had experience with the British forces for almost 10 years, as well as a significant amount of work with DPKO. We're very pleased to have him with us today. With that, we're going to move first to Sebastian. And as all of you saw, we did circulate, or rather I should say, with the registration for the event, there were several overarching questions that we asked everyone to reflect on, and many of you submitted answers to those events, which we've shared with our speakers today. And we've also asked them to think about their own reflections on these first three overarching questions. And I'd like to go through in order first to Sebastian and ask him to spend just a couple of minutes reflecting on his own perspective on the first two questions. First, in what ways has the challenge facing the humanitarian system in the region changed over the last 10 years, or how has the situation for humanitarian action in the region changed over the last 10 years? And then what do you see as the main challenges facing us today? Sebastian, I believe your audio is live, and I will turn to you for a couple of minutes of reflection.
Thank you very much indeed, Anharad, and thank you all for taking the time to join the conversation. I'll keep this brief because I think we're more interested in hearing some of the views from participants than we necessarily are from presenters. But I mean, clearly conflicts have changed enormously over the last 2 decades. Post the Cold War, we've moved away from state against state models of conflict, and we're really looking at intrastate conflicts now. With numerous potential causes, be they ethnic or religious, revolutionary, increasingly the result of failed states or even regime change. They're typified by the sort of emergence of small groups with loosely organized along political, national, ethnic, or other minority lines. And it's incredibly difficult in these modern conflicts to distinguish between combatants and civilians that don't wear uniforms, that don't act under state control. Increasingly, civilians are targets of violence, and indeed aid workers have become targets of violence. And so the sort of game slightly changed, and the answer to that is so what? Well, firstly, it's difficult to work out who is who. The sort of pattern of modern conflict makes it increasingly difficult to identify who the protagonists are, and indeed how we can engage to seek to mediate or put an end to the conflict or gain access to those in need. And the other sort of big piece before I address the specific question is that the international tools and mechanisms that we've traditionally relied on to control, to prevent, and to resolve conflicts were created to deal with conventional state-to-state models of conflict. And they're not really amenable, although they have great difficulties in adjusting to the new pattern of sort of collective violence, where one's not dealing with a sovereign authority necessarily, but dealing with non-state armed actors as prime movers behind conflict. Looking at the specific questions, in what ways have humanitarian needs in situations of armed conflicts changed over the last 10 years? I don't think the needs have necessarily changed that much, but I think more effective communications with crisis-affected people in conflict is enabling us to better understand what the needs are and how we can respond to them. But we do need to better develop these systems, which I think are still seen by too many as out there and not immediately relevant to the management of humanitarian operations, when in fact they are absolutely central and critical to the way in which we serve affected populations. In terms of the main challenges for humanitarian response and meeting the needs of affected people, access. And I think we're in a situation now where humanitarian access, where the consent of the sovereign government is the principal barrier, are becoming less and less common. That they're not happening. We still have situations where governments are holding out, and we need to think about how we can deal with the principle of non-interference. We need perhaps to think in terms of the responsibility to protect. And perhaps we need to drive that conversation home with certainly some of the states in this region, who I think can reasonably expect limits on their sovereignty when they fail or refuse to live up to their humanitarian obligations. But I'd also say on that, we are still willing, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but again, I'm keen to elicit a response. I think we as humanitarians are too willing to concede on humanitarian principles or indeed stifle our advocacy so that we ensure continued access to vulnerable populations when maybe they would be best served if we were speaking out.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for starting us out with those very helpful reflections on the first overarching questions, as well as getting into some of the more specific challenges that you've seen from your perspective in your work. I'd like to move now to Cecilia, if I could ask my colleague to bring her on the air. Cecilia, if I could ask you to also take up the thread from Sebastian, if you would, perhaps on the main challenges, but then also if you have some reflections perhaps on measures to improve the situation, or what could be done now and in the future in the region to address some of the challenges that you've seen in your work, and of course from a very different perspective. We'll just...
Okay, just picking up from the thread of what Sebastian said, and having the new challenges, or maybe enhanced challenges with regard intrastate conflicts. I very much agree with him that the humanitarian system definitely has to be a little bit more styled up when it comes to the current intrastate, and naturally also, as well, not only state, non-state armed groups, but we've also got a lot with regard to conflicts between non-state armed groups themselves. That those situations really pose challenges when it comes to accountability. Although one can always say that the state is always accountable and will have to be pushed with regard to the protection challenges, etc. Nevertheless, there is the practical implication of the difficulty of trying to get a state accountable in this. It is definitely very important to continue to try to go on this mode, because in the end of the day, whether or not the international humanitarian system is available, effective, the state will always be accountable for what is happening within its jurisdiction. And coming from the point of view of a human rights lawyer and as well as an IHL advocate, I think this is one of the targets that we should always keep in mind. The other point I'd like to make, also coming from Sebastian's start of the conversation, is actually with regard to the protection challenges. I do agree that the needs and the rights that are deprived and even violated are more or less the same. However, I think that there is now a different sense in terms of intensity. And the intensity of this is because of the protractedness of the armed conflict, and as well as with regard to the suffering that the people are experiencing. And lastly, as well, because of the high level of the violence that is definitely now being obtained by the... So with those two, I'd like to just kick off the conversation alongside Sebastian, and these are really just two main points: the accountability of the state, and secondly, the more intense protection challenges that we have right now.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for those comments, and my apologies to everyone regarding the audio quality. It seems that the system continues to reset the audio to some difficult levels. So just a quick note for the rest of the event, if I could ask particularly Cecilia and Carsten, since we had some issues with the audio previously, if you wouldn't mind just looking every couple of minutes at the setting to make sure that in Cecilia's case your audio is set lower, and in Carsten's case to make sure it's set higher so that we can keep those levels. And again, apologies. There will be a summary of the presentations after the event. So for any of you who are having difficulty hearing, we will be preparing quite a detailed summary of everyone's comments after the event, and we'll circulate circulated just a few days afterwards. So thank you again, Cecilia, for those very helpful comments. And moving us down the line of these overarching questions, we'd like to now move to Carsten to again pick up the thread regarding measures to improve the situation. Carsten, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a couple of minutes of your thoughts on that, and then I'll take back the floor to start distributing some of the more specific questions that have come in and comments from the participants. So Carsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, what concrete measures should be undertaken in the North and South Asia region to improve humanitarian response to situations of armed conflict? Now, that's a big question, and I'll try to fit in as much as I can. The need, this differing level requires a specifically tailored national preparedness and response capacity, and it also requires us to even more in the future to build on regional efforts, as we've seen the growing success of the ASEAN initiative, in which my organization, Oxfam, is involved in building capacity of national governments in their understanding of their responsibilities and their capabilities towards their affected populations for who they are the legal duty bearers. In terms of very practical things that can be undertaken, in terms of preparedness, I am still amazed on how we globally struggle with country-level preparedness. I think we still need to continue improving interagency contingency planning and preparedness in each country. Only a good preparedness makes for a good response. It is obvious, we all know that. We know that investments in preparedness and, of course, preventions pay off. A lot of organizations minimum preparedness actions. I don't think this is enough. I think we need to integrate our preparedness efforts much more. For example, out of the UK, there's a new Help Age-led initiative where a few organizations trying to monitor and develop their preparedness plans collectively. It's called Alert. It's going to be also probably financially supported from the START network, which is a very exciting attempt to look across organizational barriers, because individual organizations working in an isolated manner cannot be effective. And in terms of putting that into the context of conflict settings, I think already in the preparedness phase, having a proper analysis and mapping of conflict situations, actors, and a good understanding before we engage in a response is really, really necessary. And then the next step for me that we shouldn't forget is when we talk about response to humanitarian settings, every humanitarian crisis is actually a development problem. It's a result of failed development or of mistakes or problems in development processes. So we need to link in with development work and policy work and also advocacy on issues like conflict transformation. And that, in my opinion, needs to go clearly beyond addressing the issues of visible direct violence, the efforts around peace building and reintegration of ex-combatants, but it needs to go much deeper into issues of the less visible elements of violence, like the attitudes, cultural violence. We have tools, for example, we need to push very strongly also in the Asia region on the implementation of the UN resolutions regarding women, peace and security to help promote gender justice. And we also need to address the root causes of conflicts, things like structural violence, for example, tackling issues of governance and security sector reform and so on and so forth. So that is in the realm of preparedness before we even go into the response, where a lot more needs to be done. I think also issues around creating more regional peer accountability, as we have that in ASEAN, and I understand in the South Asia regions, efforts are starting in this regard as well. Peer accountability between state actors for compliance with international humanitarian and refugee and human rights laws, international standards, humanitarian principles and norms. We have so many legal tools but the application and the compliance is still a major issue in all regions, including in the Asia region. We also need to strengthen the dialogue around humanitarian principles with all relevant actors. And since because we have a problem with acceptance, increasing problem with acceptance of humanitarian principles, there are too many arguments around this is not applicable universally, or not in all cultural settings, or not for all religions, and we need to take this dialogue around humanitarian principles much more out there before, during, and after each crisis that we're having. And since the challenges are growing, everybody knows about the rising number and scale of humanitarian crisis. We need to keep building the capacity of all actors, and that includes local, national, international civil society organizations, state institutions, regional structures, and international organizations. And we also need to better involve the private sector that plays, particularly also in the Asia region, much more stronger role nowadays than it did a few years ago. And we need to include of all these parties the efforts to increase conflict sensitivity and the ability to act in a more positively transformational way in conflict settings. And then if you translate that into a response situation, I think it was mentioned before, so I don't want to go too much into details as my previous speakers elaborated already. There is the major challenge of humanitarian access. I think we need to realize that, particularly in the response situation, negotiating access, negotiating with our counterparts requires substantially a lot more capacity than we often presume and we are aware of and that we are willing to accept. And so we need to put these capacities in place in order to make that happen. And we need to focus much more strongly on the humanitarian protection elements around understanding vulnerability of marginalized groups. In conflict settings, we should not underestimate or ignore, as in many cases, the gender dimension. Involving women in reconciliation processes is in most cases a success story, but it's often neglected or ignored due to cultural biases. And how that all can play out, what I've mentioned so far, I just want to give one example that I have visited last year, where I've seen where even in a country like China, where there's a lot of assumptions being made around the role of civil society being very limited and state capacity being sufficient to handle large-scale crisis. I visited last year in summer the response to the Yan earthquake of Oxfam. And obviously Oxfam International has limited access to disaster regions in China, but Oxfam Hong Kong does have. They have a good working relationship with the authorities. And I think it's very important then as a professional humanitarian actor to simply role model how you would like to see the response and thereby take others along with you. And I'm raising a little bit the flag of my colleagues from Oxfam Hong Kong. They had stockpiles in the affected region because their contingency plan told them this is where disasters are most likely to happen. So they arrived in theater of the disaster zone with relief supplies within 12 hours. They had, a CAT fund available to immediately disperse resources. So there was a very quick mobilization also of technical experts. And they linked in with national and local, very small local organizations, very localized operating organizations that had their capacity already being built, their technical capacity, but they had the community and embedded capacity to mobilize people. And then that was scaled up through the partners, but then also by creating demonstration projects, technical demonstration projects that helped different parts of the community to work together in setting up projects that the government found so impressive that they agreed to copy them when they brought in their resources and their capacities that were, of course, dwarfing what any civil society organization can do, but often is lacking the fine-tuned technical expertise. That collaboration actually then reached millions and millions of people where one organization could have actually only reached a few. And you build these collaborations beforehand when you want to discuss about how you apply humanitarian principles, including impartiality in conflict situations with the governments. Then you need to take those steps beforehand. So Oxfam has, for example, translated the Sphere Handbook into Chinese, into Mandarin, and then trained government officials at the regional and local level on how to use it. And then you have a very different discussion in the situation of response, what that means, including the application of humanitarian principles, not just technical standards. So I want to end it here.
Carsten, actually, while we still have you on the line, I'd like to go to one of the specific questions that came in from one of our participants. There was a question from Oscar, who's a community capacity building advisor in Gibraltar, and he's asking, how do you maintain neutrality when trying to reach the vulnerable and those in need, citing that he personally experienced great difficulties in Southeast Asia in the late 70s and early 80s in reaching victims in a certain situation, but of course this is a challenge that continues into today and will no doubt be a challenge in the future.
Thank you for this interesting question. I have to, however, say I would like to reframe it a little bit and shift from the term neutrality to impartiality instead. Neutrality is a concept not all humanitarian organizations can really agree to comply with, which is also consistent with the principles of the Code of Conduct, where the principle of neutrality was not included because it's primarily directed at the very particular mandate of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. Neutrality means not to take side in hostilities or engage at any time in controversies of political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. And most humanitarian actors, including organizations like Oxfam, do to some extent take sides on behalf of victims, particularly when there are clear perpetrations of atrocities or violations of international humanitarian law, for example. So therefore, let me focus on impartiality instead, because I think that is more applicable in this context, in the context of provision of humanitarian assistance as we are discussing it right now, which basically then refers to humanitarian assistance needing to be provided based on need alone and not based on nationality, race, religion, political point of view. And then the question on how to apply that in conflict settings, or in particular in Asia. I would say we have some interesting challenges these days, starting with our own humanitarian identity and how we are perceived, particularly also by governments, but also by other actors. Because we have, I wouldn't say a proliferation of humanitarian actors, but we have a larger diversity of humanitarian actors. And so more and more questions are asked from different actors in response settings and conflict settings. Who am I actually dealing with here? Who are you? Who you say you're a humanitarian organization? When I see you as a, US contractor who has a USAID contract, you're presenting yourself like a humanitarian NGO. Are you, or are you business, or what are you? Or a UN agency, when the UN is involved in both peacekeeping and response coordination and response implementation, how are you as an impartial humanitarian actor? So there is a lot of complexity. Picking only those two examples, there are a lot more that I could give. That where we as humanitarian actors, I think, need to be more clarity on who we are and what role we are playing in the context and what we bring to the table, and based on what mandates we're operating. So that's the first piece, and that is, I agree with, it's a growing challenge, which stands side by side with a stronger assertiveness of national governments trying to regulate and not just regulate, but sometimes also restrict access to the population that they are legally responsible for as legal duty bearers. And there is, I mean, I'll take maybe one example from another region on how we as Oxfam are approaching that because we are very aware of those challenges. And I'd like to take an extreme example to show what sometimes is possible, knowing that in particular situations that can be different. Let me take the example of Syria while I'm actually remembering to check if my audio settings are still okay. Yeah, they seem to be. When Oxfam decided to try to work inside Syria and to negotiate access with the government of Syria, which obviously is a partisan in a conflict, is a party in a conflict, and is a documented perpetrator of violations against international humanitarian law, we actually entered in those negotiations with full transparency of what we bring to the table in terms of our technical capacity and the benefit we can bring, but also being very transparent about us being a very outspoken, vocal, in that sense, to some extent, political actor that are speaking out on behalf of the people affected by disasters and pointing out violations of international humanitarian law and international regulations that affect people in that situation. So the Syrian government not only knew that, but they were told by us very clearly who they are dealing with. They basically didn't have to, as we say in German, buy the cat in the bag, but they had right in front of them that strong humanitarian response organization that is also a very strong humanitarian advocacy organization that basically said, well, we will speak out about what we see. And some people might see it as a surprise, but we have actually very often that experience that the government of Syria, as well as other conflict parties, some of the opposition parties, were then very clear and said to us, okay, we know what we are getting ourselves into. We need you to help. Your technical expertise and your capacity is required. But we also want you to be very aware that we tolerate your advocacy and your campaigning only as long as it is evidence-based, which, you know, puts the responsibility then on both sides. We were tolerated, but we had to prove that we know what we're talking about and that what we're publicizing, and that we are doing it in an ongoing dialogue with all the parties involved. And based on that transparency, we have an ongoing cooperation with parties in the conflict. So our teams, for example, that are based out of Damascus can cross the lines, the conflict lines, and work in opposition-held areas. And of course, everybody knows those lines are changing daily, and we not always get access due to, you know, when the conflict is rising. But we are allowed to work on different sides of the conflicts and reach people on different sides. And that shows a little bit what sometimes is possible as long as you are open and transparent and you explain the principles based on which you're operating. Now, as I said, not every government will accept that, but if I translate that now into the context of Asia, if I see how Oxfam India, for example, is perceived in India, Oxfam India has been asked by the Indian government to work in Assam because particularly it is seen as an impartial actor, despite being very outspoken about atrocities and also all of the government in some of the conflict situations. And the government, for example, has also asked Oxfam to work in the conflict areas where we have sectarian violence, where Hindu and Muslim community are entrenched in conflict, long-standing structural conflict, and has asked Oxfam to operate there because it is seen as an impartial actor. So the principle of impartiality, if you actually live it in a very transparent and open and proactive way, can really help you to get access where other organizations who are less visible, who are less outspoken, where their objectives are less clear, might struggle much more in terms of getting the access. So I want to end it here.
Great, thank you very much, Carsten. And your audio was fine the whole time. And thanks so much for the really thoughtful comments, and I think a really interesting and useful reframing of the question. So if I could now actually move to Cecilia, I have a series of related questions that I'd like to pose to you, Cecilia, and I'll make, of course, the note regarding your audio, if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye on it and making sure the levels stay down, that would be really helpful for everyone to be able to hear. But first of all, in the series, I'd be interested to hear from you, Cecilia, your own reflections on the same question originally posed by Oscar in terms of neutrality, but perhaps reflecting also on the way in which Carsten would suggest reframing it to focus more on impartiality and the difficulties related to these principles and actually reaching the populations in need. But then a couple of other related questions that I would bring in. So first, looking at a question that came in from Milet, who's based in the Philippines, and is asking, what is the concrete direction of the UN global community in the management of humanitarian assistance in conflict areas? And then another question, also related, but moving a little bit towards the natural disaster questions from Hannah, who is participating today from Switzerland and is involved in the Nansen initiative, which everyone may be familiar with. Hannah is asking, what protection and assistance challenges and opportunities do humanitarian actors face when natural disasters affect conflict areas, as has commonly occurred in the region, including, of course, in the Philippines, which is a context I know, Cecilia, you're very familiar with. So with those three questions, I think we'll bring your audio on, Cecilia, and give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those questions. Just coming from what Carsten said, well, first of all, I would like to give my point of view that humanitarian actors are not merely international. We also have national humanitarian actors. But I would go one step further, and this is also coming from what Carsten said in his presentation, that there is a need for capacity building of national actors with regard to humanitarian response. From where I am coming from, humanitarian actors at the national level have to be trained and really capacitated, and the principle should be asked, really emphasized again and again, that humanitarian assistance should therefore be impartial. However, there are also some entities, for example, like the Commission on Human Rights and even the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where which entities are supposed to be very close to the victims. I would even say that they should not be neutral. Why? Because they should always be on the part of the victims and should always be in a way that will actually cater to the emergency and long-term and even durable solutions, protection needs of the victims. So I would say that neutrality and impartiality do not only depend on the context, but it also depends on who is out there catering to the needs and to the rights of the actors, of the victims themselves. And looking as well as victims, not just as victims, nor as beneficiaries, but also people, populations, and communities who can actually be empowered. This is easier said than done, obviously, in conflict situations like what we have in the Philippines. Nevertheless, there seems to be always a capacity, if you might want to say, of state entities forgetting that communities and the internally displaced persons actually should be participating in anything that concerns their lives, in any of the protection challenges, so that they themselves can actually be actors rather than as passive beneficiaries. The second point that I'd like to make concerns the question of Millet about the role of the UN. Now, normally the United Nations humanitarian system should really be only coming in to complement the work of the national stakeholders. And I'm very this is my very principled stand, that the UN should actually not be substituting in humanitarian emergencies unless there is a real need. And that's why we go back again to the issue of ensuring and trying to capacitate national stakeholders to actually be the one to respond to the protection challenges. Of course, a lot of the government, a lot of the states are themselves part of the conflict. And we know all this, like, Millet, your question really, Millet, is not what is, but I think what should be the role. But this is why I think this is an advocacy point that we have to make, that there is actually a partnership between the UN system and the national stakeholders, rather than, a top to bottom, or the UN coming in necessarily to substitute government. Most of the time, that's what's happening, and actually partnership here is something that we really, from the national stakeholder perspective, this is something that we have to build on again and again, because we do forget. Because of time, it's already 52, but I'd like to go to the question of Hannah about natural disasters affecting conflict areas. And I think this comes to the point of view that in the end, the IDPs and the people who are vulnerable, who are in need of protection, it doesn't really matter where they come, if they come from an armed conflict or a natural disaster. There are some nuances, definitely, but in the end of the day, we should look at them as rights bearers. However, definitely, this point, for example, in Zamboanga, where we have an armed conflict, and then later on, natural disaster came in terms of the floods, I think this really makes the point that armed conflict and natural disasters cannot be treated separately as, as humanitarian emergencies, but they should be looked at in terms of how we can respond to the people affected. And disaster management, disaster risk management, okay, this is something that's probably out of the humanitarian system in classic textbook, but I think we should be challenged into looking at this, despite the fact that we're only looking at armed conflict. Because in the end of the day, we have already at least three, within the last 6 months in the Philippines, we've had 3 situations of armed conflict where natural disasters came in and actually affected the already vulnerable populations.
Right. Thank you very much, Cecilia, for those comments. And I have to say, this is turning into a really rich discussion, which is thanks both, of course, to our guest speakers, but also to our great participation from everyone in the chat. So thanks to all of you. We are running short on time, as Cecilia noted, but I would like to move to 2 things. First, I'll point out some of the results of the polls that are running, but then I'd like to move to Sebastian. And Sebastian, if you wouldn't mind perhaps just addressing again from your own perspective those last 2 points that Cecilia was speaking about. So looking at Hannah's question regarding what protection and assistance challenges and opportunities humanitarian actors face in those situations where natural disaster is affecting areas that are already in a conflict situation. And then also the question which came up previously regarding the concrete direction of the UN global community in terms of the management of humanitarian assistance in conflict areas. So those are a couple of questions for Sebastian. And in the meantime, I'll draw everyone's attention to some of the results that have come in. So to the question regarding whether communities affected by conflict trust international humanitarian actors and welcome assistance, we can see that there's quite some concern here regarding the levels of trust. So with a significant majority of you having the opinion that it's only about 50% of the time that communities are really trusting international humanitarian actors and in their work. work. We have another survey running here regarding what the primary focus of the international humanitarian system should be, and I'd encourage everyone to try to answer that in these last few minutes. But in the meantime, Sebastian, I give you the floor for these. We'll consider them perhaps final comments and reflections for the event.
I think in terms of the concrete direction of the UN global community and the management of humanitarian assistance in conflict areas, we wouldn't be having this discussion if there was a concrete direction. I think, frankly, it's forums like this where we're driving to get the direction we want to be going in. I mean, I'd certainly say a couple of things. Rather than the concrete direction, I'd say that we need to be much more politically savvy in how we respond during conflicts. And again, to be slightly controversial, I'd say that we can respond by strictly to humanitarian principles on needs-based action, or we can understand that we need to balance engagement in order to get the job done. And this is that rather unpleasant expression that some people use of principle pragmatism, situating the humanitarian principles in a modern context. So it's practical adaptation, I think, to get the job done, adaptation to the operational environment. And as Carsten said, where this is complicated, we need to enhance preparedness. We need to dedicate resources today to save lives tomorrow, which is. I also think whether it's in disasters or in complex emergencies, we're still far too focused on our own needs and on donor needs, and we need to refocus on beneficiary-centered humanitarianism. And I don't know if you heard what Jean-François Vidal of Action contre la Faim said on this, but he said the problem with the traditional ideas of humanitarianism is that they demand access for humanitarian workers to reach victims who then become the object of our compassion, when in fact what we should be supporting is the victims' access to their rights. So a construction that makes them subjects, not objects. And I can't tell you the amount of times when we look at the construct of humanitarian aid in any context, and it's a top-down model from donor to aid worker to beneficiary, and we need to flip that on its head. And I think I'll stop there, just trying to be a little, again, controversial.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. And this is an excellent forum in which people should and can be controversial. And I really want to thank you for those provoking comments. And I can see that we have a really rich discussion happening in the chat, and also a number of follow-up questions coming for all of our speakers, and including now for Sebastian. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. It's been a very short and very active hour, so we are going to have to cut it short now. We'll just take a quick look at the survey results that have just come in. So regarding the primary focus of the international system, it looks like a really almost a very strong majority of people in the event today believe that the priority should be responding directly to meet the needs of affected communities, and that would be yes, so rather than a focus on coordination with any one particular actor, of course. We will be taking all of the interesting inputs that have come in around this event, including the registration comments that everyone made, but also, of course, summaries of the audio discussion and what's been going on in the chat. We'll put that all together into a document to circulate to all of you, but also to contribute to the ongoing summit process. And hope that all of you will be interested in continuing the conversation with us in future events, and also in the online system that's set up by OCHA to manage the Humanitarian Summit discussions. I'd like to thank many partners for helping us spread information about this event, including at ReliefWeb, IRIN, ALNAP, IFRC, the Sphere Project, IIHA at Fordham, the Humanitarian Advisory Group in Australia, and many others. And a warm thank you to all of our speakers and to all of our participants. We're going to have to leave it at that today and look forward to our next event. In the meantime, this is Ann Lang and the PHAP team signing off from Brussels.
Thank you very much.